The 38th floor penthouse was swallowed in darkness at noon, curtains sealed shut. The air hung thick, stale cigarette smoke and something heavier, something irreversible. Eleanor Shaw lay motionless across silk sheets, each breath slow and deliberate, as if she were rationing what little she had left. She didn't look up when the door opened. Her eyes stayed shut, her voice barely a thread above silence. "Please, just make it fast." The toolbox hit the marble floor. Marcus Webb stood frozen in the doorway, a plumber from Brooklyn, who had no script for this. He saw the open pill bottle on the nightstand. He saw her, 34 years old, CEO of a $2.4 billion empire, lying there like someone who had already said goodbye to everything. 11 seconds, no protocol, no training, just a choice, and the question of whether one ordinary man could pull someone back from the edge of forever. Marcus Webb had a rule about volunteering for jobs nobody else wanted, that he always said yes. Not because he was a hero, because heroism was for people who had time to think about it, and Marcus hadn't had that kind of time in 4 years. He was on the 35th floor when the building manager flagged him down, voice low the way people get when they're pretending something isn't serious. Penthouse 38's been reporting low water pressure for 3 days. Shaw unit. The manager glanced toward the elevator like the building itself made him uneasy. Nobody's gone up. She doesn't really open the door for anyone. The other crew members found reasons to be busy. Marcus picked up his toolbox. "I've handled that type before," he said. It was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that costs nothing until it does. On most mornings, Marcus was out of the Brooklyn apartment by 6:15. He made coffee in the dark, packed Danny's lunch, and left a note on the kitchen table, even though Danny was 8 years old and perfectly capable of reading the whiteboard on the fridge. The notes were a habit he'd kept from when his wife, Claire, was alive. She used to say that people needed to know they were being thought of even in small ways, especially in small ways. Danny's habit was different. Every night without fail before the light went out in his bedroom, he'd call through the door, "Dad, did you meet anyone who needed help today?" Some nights Marcus said no, but he always thought about it. Danny had been born with a congenital heart defect that 3 specialists had described using words Marcus had to look up afterward. The surgery was not optional. It was not cheap. It was scheduled if everything went right, if the savings account held, if the overtime hours kept coming in 18 months. Marcus had a sticky note on his bathroom mirror with the target number written in black marker. He looked at it every morning. It was not an inspirational quote. It was a deadline. He didn't talk about it much. There was no one to tell who could do anything about it. And Marcus had never been the kind of man who spoke about his problems as though speaking could solve them. Claire used to say that about him too, that he was better at showing up than explaining himself. She'd meant it as a compliment. He chose to believe her. The elevator to the 38th floor required a key card. The building manager handed it over without making eye contact. The hallway up there was different from the others, quieter. The carpet was thicker. The light fixtures probably cost more than Marcus's truck. He walked to the end unit and knocked twice the way a plumber knocks professional neutral, announcing a function, not an intrusion. Nothing. He knocked again. Maintenance. Building reported a pressure issue on this floor. Just need a few minutes. A long beat. Then the door opened. What Marcus had expected without quite knowing he'd expected it was someone imperious, someone who would look at him and his toolbox and make him feel the distance between the 38th floor and Brooklyn in one glance. That was the image the name Eleanor Shaw carried. Forbes had put her on the cover twice. The youngest disruptor of the decade, the headline read. The woman who'd built Nova Bridge Tech from a rented desk in a midtown co-working space into a $2.4 billion company that was quietly rewriting how Americans with low incomes accessed healthcare technology. What he found was a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 weeks. She was young, younger than he'd imagined, though he knew she was 34. She was wearing a gray pullover that was too big for her frame, and her feet were bare on the marble floor, and she held the door like she needed it to hold her up. Her eyes, when they met, his held the specific flatness of someone who had stopped performing the ordinary theater of being fine. She said nothing, just stepped aside. Marcus walked in. The penthouse was not what he'd expected either. It was the kind of space that had been designed to impress floor-to-ceiling glass, a view of Manhattan that would make most people stop breathing, but it had been converted into something else entirely. A whiteboard, covered in equations and flowcharts, stood against one wall. Stacks of legal folders formed uneven columns on the dining table. An open laptop threw pale light into the room, its screen dense with text. And there on the nightstand beside the bed, a prescription bottle sat open, its white cap off. Marcus walked to the bathroom. He turned on the tap. The water pressure was in fact low, not dangerously so, but real enough. He crouched down and opened the cabinet under the sink, giving himself something to look at while he thought. He had a very specific feeling in his chest, the kind that came with the awareness that a situation was larger than the task he'd been handed. When he stood and turned around, Eleanor Shaw was sitting on the edge of the bed. She hadn't moved far. She was looking at the floor, and her shoulders were pulled inward, and she looked so profoundly exhausted that Marcus thought of the word spent. Not tired, not sad, but spent like a thing that had given everything it had and found itself empty on the other side of it. That was when she spoke, not to him exactly. The words came out like she'd been holding them too long. Please. Just make it fast. The toolbox left his hand before he'd made a decision. It hit the marble with a sound that ricocheted off the glass walls and the high ceilings and came back to him smaller, like an echo from a very large distance. He stood there. He looked at the woman. He looked at the nightstand. There was a version of this moment where he walked back out and called the building manager, and the building manager called someone else, and the chain of protocol did what it was designed to do. Marcus knew that version. He'd been trained for it in the vague and theoretical way that tradespeople get trained for situations that aren't in the manual. But Claire's voice was in his head the way it always showed up when he was standing at a decision he couldn't take back. Don't ever pretend you don't see someone going under. He crouched down slowly. He began picking up the screws that had scattered from the toolbox across the floor, gathering them one by one into his palm, the way a person gathers small things when they need a moment to find the right words. I'm here for the pressure issue in the bathroom. His voice was even. Calm the way a job site is calm, not because nothing is happening, but because there is work to be done, and panic is not useful. The faucet in the main bath, has that been running weak for long, or just the past few days? The room was very still. Then Eleanor Shaw opened her eyes. She looked at him the way you look at something that doesn't fit the equation you've been running in your head, with a confusion that is almost indistinguishable from relief. She did not answer his question. She didn't know how. The script she'd written for this morning had not included someone crouching on her floor, asking about her faucet. Marcus kept his eyes on the screws in his palm. He didn't call for help. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't say any of the things that people say when they find themselves in a room with someone who is drowning. He just stayed. And for Eleanor Shaw, who had spent 6 months being managed, assessed, projected upon, and pitied being stayed with by someone who asked about her faucet, was the strangest, most disarming thing that had happened to her in longer than she could name. She didn't speak, but she didn't ask him to leave. That was the 11 seconds nobody would ever be able to explain. Not the building manager, not the board of directors, not the journalist who would later try to write the story of Nova Bridge's survival and find that it kept coming back to a Tuesday morning on the 38th floor, a dropped toolbox, and a plumber from Brooklyn who had learned from his late wife that the bravest thing a person can do is pretend very calmly that everything is still fixable until it is. He came back on Thursday. Eleanor didn't open the door. He knocked twice, said it was a follow-up on the pressure valve, and she stood on her side of the door and said nothing until she heard the elevator take him back down. She told herself that was the end of it. He came back on Tuesday. This time, the building manager was with him, apologetic and hovering, saying something about a pipe survey on the upper floors. Eleanor opened the door because there were two of them, and it was harder to refuse two people. Marcus walked in, did something to the water line in the kitchen, and left in under 20 minutes. He didn't look at the nightstand. He didn't ask how she was. On his way out, he set a small tin on the kitchen counter without a word. She threw it in the trash. Then she took it out. The cookies inside were burned at the edges, uneven, clearly made by someone who did not bake professionally, or even competently. There was a folded piece of paper tucked beneath them, a drawing in green crayon of a woman with a long, dark cape, standing on top of a tall building, arms out like she was about to fly. Beneath it, in the handwriting of a child, still learning to keep letters, the same size. Danny says, "Eat up. Don't waste my hard work." Eleanor sat down on the kitchen floor. She ate one cookie, then she cried. For the first time since the biopsy results, really cried, the kind that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with something inside finally giving way. She sat there on the cold marble with a burned cookie in her hand and cried until she was empty. And then she washed her face, and then she went back to the whiteboard, because the whiteboard was the only place in the apartment that still felt like her. Marcus kept coming, Tuesdays and Fridays, always with a reason, a fixture, a fitting, a routine check on a system that was by any honest assessment functioning fine. Eleanor stopped pretending she didn't hear the knock. She started opening the door on the second one instead of the third. She didn't speak much, neither did he. He worked on things that may or may not have needed working on, and she sat at the dining table with her legal folders and her laptop, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't require filling. Danny's contributions escalated. A small jar of honey with a post-it reading, "For tea." B's worked hard too. A paperback with the cover torn off and a note bored of it at chapter 6. "See if you do better." D, a second drawing, this one of the same woman, but now sitting at a desk, a small figure standing beside her with what appeared to be a wrench. "The lady and dad, fixing things," it said on the back. Eleanor taped that one to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. She didn't examine why. It was a Friday afternoon 6 weeks after the first visit when everything shifted. Marcus was under the bathroom sink when Eleanor's laptop chimed. She was at the table, and she leaned forward to read the notification, and something in the room changed, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the building's HVAC system. Marcus came out of the bathroom to find her standing very still in front of the screen. He could see the email from where he stood. The name at the top, Ryan Caldwell. He didn't read the full text, but he caught enough phrases like board confidence and operational continuity and temporary incapacitation to understand the shape of what he was looking at. Eleanor closed the laptop. Her voice when she spoke had the particular quality of someone keeping a very heavy door shut through sheer will. "He's been my partner for 7 years. Marcus set down the wrench. Eleanor turned. The flatness was back in her eyes, but it was a different kind now. Not the exhaustion of someone who had stopped fighting, but the particular cold of someone who has just confirmed the thing they'd been trying not to believe. "He's calling me mentally incapacitated." Her voice stayed level. "He's using my diagnosis to push me out. And when he's done, he's selling Nova Bridge to Hargrove Pharmaceutical." Marcus knew the name. Most people in his position did not from the financial pages, but from the other direction. From the insurance denial letters, from the coverage gaps, from the specific kind of bureaucratic cruelty that dresses itself in terms and conditions. He told her about Danny then, not as a plea, not as a manipulation, just as a fact, the way he talked about most things. The surgery, the timeline, the way he'd been researching which hospitals took, which coverage combinations, and how Nova Bridge's AI tools had been the first system that actually translated the insurance language into something a person without a law degree could understand. How one of the other fathers in Danny's school had used it to appeal a claim denial and won. Eleanor listened to all of it without moving. "There are hundreds of families like yours," she said finally, not to comfort him, more like she was accounting for something. "That was the whole point. That's why I built it." The thing she didn't say out loud was that Hargrove had denied her mother's treatment coverage 11 years ago during the 18 months that preceded her mother's death. That Nova Bridge had been from its first line of code a specific answer to a specific wrong. Selling it to the company that had made the wrong was not a business decision. It was an erasure. "I need your help," Eleanor said. It was the first time in 6 weeks she had asked anyone for anything. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of corporate intrigue that gets dramatized with sleek conference rooms and people in expensive coats delivering sharp lines. It was Marcus in parking garages on his lunch breaks, photographing documents through a glass door because the angle didn't allow for anything better. It was Eleanor on the phone with her attorney at 2 in the morning, voice hoarse from a chemotherapy session that had left her unable to stand without holding on to something. The treatments had started. The oncologist had been direct stage 3 treatable, but the road was not going to be manageable. It was going to be something you survived by deciding repeatedly to keep going. Some mornings Marcus arrived and she didn't answer the door because her hands were shaking too badly to work the handle. He would sit in the hallway on the bench outside the elevator because leaving felt wrong and entering without permission felt worse, and he'd wait until he heard movement inside. She never asked him to do that. He never told her he was doing it. Danny sent a new drawing, the same woman from before, but this time standing up straight, both hands on a table looking forward. On the back, Dad said, "You're learning to stand again. This is what I think that looks like." Eleanor folded it in half and put it in her blazer pocket. She wore it to her next attorney meeting. Ryan Caldwell had not been idle. Eleanor had assumed he was opportunistic, a man who saw a window and moved toward it. What Marcus's photographs revealed, cross-referenced with the financial disclosures Eleanor's attorney subpoenaed, was something older and more deliberate. Caldwell had been in contact with Hargrove Pharmaceuticals' acquisition team for 8 months. 3 months before Eleanor's diagnosis. The cancer had not created his plan. It had simply accelerated it. The emergency board meeting was called for a Thursday morning. Eleanor wore the blazer she'd been photographed in the day. Nova Bridge launched 7 years ago a Tuesday, a rented space in Midtown with folding chairs and a projector that kept losing signal. She'd been standing in the middle of the frame, and her eyes in that photo were the kind of bright that doesn't come from lighting. She'd worn that blazer 3 times since. This was the 4th. Her hair had thinned noticeably. She didn't try to disguise it. She walked into the boardroom and placed a printed copy of the evidence timeline in front of each chair herself, moving slowly, deliberately, because her body required it now in a way it hadn't 6 months ago. She presented the case for 40 minutes. Caldwell sat at the far end of the table and let her finish before he spoke. What he produced was not a counter-argument. It was a file. Her medical records. Full treatment, history, current prognosis medication log, obtained as Eleanor's attorney, would later confirm through a breach that violated federal privacy law. But in that room, in that moment, what it produced was exactly what Caldwell had calculated, 5 of the 9 board members shifting in their chairs. Looking at her and doing the arithmetic that people do when they are weighing capability against optics and finding the math uncomfortable, one of the members, Thomas Reed, who had been at the launch in the folding chair days, looked at the table instead of at her. Eleanor stood at the head of the room. Her hands were on the edge of the table because they needed to be. She had prepared for the evidence. She had not fully prepared for the specific exhaustion of being looked at by people who had believed in her and were now calculating the cost of continuing to. She found Marcus at the back of the room. She had given him a chair there, introduced to the board, as a security consultant, which was technically a category of person who could be present. He was sitting in his good jacket, the one he wore to Danny's school performances, with his hands folded on his knees, and he was looking at her, the way someone looks at a person they have sat in a hallway for, with the particular steadiness of someone who already made their decision and is not in the process of reconsidering it. Eleanor looked at him for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she looked back at the board. "I understand what you're weighing," she said. Her voice did not shake. "Take the week. Review the timeline in front of you. Review it against what Mr. Caldwell presented, and ask yourselves which of the two was obtained legally." She reached down and picked up her copy of the timeline. "This meeting is adjourned." She walked out. She made it to the elevator before her legs decided they were finished for the day. She didn't make it to the car. Marcus found her sitting on the floor of the elevator lobby, not collapsed, not unconscious, just done. Her back against the wall legs out in front of her, the blazer still buttoned. She was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that isn't coming out right. He sat down beside her, not across from her, not crouching in front of her, the way people do when they want to appear helpful, without committing to the floor. He sat down on the lobby tile with his back against the same wall, and his good jacket and his folded timeline, and he stayed there. A long time passed. I started that morning thinking it was the last one. Eleanor's voice had no performance in it. No corporate register, no careful calibration. Just the flat fact of it. The morning you came. I had decided. She looked at her hands in her lap. And now I've spent 2 months hoping, and I think hoping might be worse. Marcus was quiet for long enough that it didn't feel like avoidance. After Claire died, he said, "I sat in the hospital parking lot for 4 hours. Couldn't make myself get out of the car. I knew Danny was home with my sister. I knew he was fine. I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do next." What the point of the next thing was. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward him. My phone rang. It was Danny. 4 years old, and he'd gotten hold of my sister's cell somehow. And when I picked up, he just said... Marcus stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, turning the screen toward her. A photo of Danny gap-toothed, squinting into sunlight, holding up a fish he'd caught that was significantly smaller than his pride in it. He said, "Dad, are you coming home for dinner?" That was it. That was the whole question. Eleanor looked at the photo for a long moment. "He didn't fix anything," Marcus said. "He just needed me to come home. And I realized people who keep going aren't people who aren't scared. They're people who have somewhere to be." Eleanor looked at the photo of the boy with the small fish and the enormous grin, and she thought about the hundreds of families she had never met who had used Nova Bridge's tools to fight insurance denials and win. She thought about the feature her engineering team had been developing for early detection, the one that her lead researcher had told her 6 weeks into Eleanor's own diagnosis could have caught hers a full year earlier. She thought about what it meant to sell that to the company that had taught her, at 23 years old, that some people's lives were worth less when the math didn't work out. "Yes," she said. Marcus looked at her. "You asked if I had a reason." She handed his phone back. "Yes." That night from the penthouse, Eleanor made 3 calls she had been putting off. The first was to her attorney, who had been waiting for the go-ahead on a motion that would formally challenge the legality of the board meeting and the disclosed medical records. The second was to 2 board members, Margaret Holloway and James Pritchard, who had not shifted in their chairs when Caldwell produced the file, and who had been Eleanor, now understood waiting for her to call them first. The third call was to her mother. It lasted 47 minutes. Marcus sat in the kitchen and did not pretend he couldn't hear it. He made tea because that was something to do with his hands, and he left a cup near Eleanor's elbow without interrupting, and he heard her voice crack exactly. Once the word scared landing in the air between her and whoever was on the other end of the line, and then steady itself and continue. When she hung up, she looked at the cup of tea, like she'd forgotten cups of tea were a thing that existed. "She cried," Eleanor said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I didn't want her to cry. That's why I didn't call." She picked up the cup. "I thought I was protecting her." Marcus thought about all the things Claire had not told him in the last months of her life, the things he'd found out afterward, the things she'd managed alone because she didn't want him to worry. He thought about how the protection had been real and the cost of it had also been real. "People who love you want to know," he said, "even when it's bad, especially when it's bad." Eleanor drank the tea. Outside Manhattan arranged itself 40 floors below them, indifferent and luminous. The decisive evidence was not dramatic. It rarely is. What Marcus had found, buried in a sequence of financial disclosures that Eleanor's attorney had subpoenaed, was a wire transfer dated 8 months before Eleanor's diagnosis. Caldwell had received a consulting payment from a subsidiary of Hargrove Pharmaceutical for an amount large enough to mean something and structured carefully enough to suggest he'd thought about how it would look. 3 subsequent payments followed, each routed through a different intermediary, each corresponding to a date on which Caldwell had taken a specific action inside Nova Bridge: a procurement delay, a personnel decision, a data-sharing proposal that would have given Hargrove early access to Nova Bridge's proprietary algorithms. He hadn't been waiting for an opportunity. He had been creating the conditions for one. Eleanor's attorney presented this to the board's legal counsel on a Wednesday morning, alongside a formal complaint filed with federal regulators regarding the medical records breach. The HypaAI violation alone was sufficient to invalidate the procedural basis for the emergency meeting. Combined with the financial evidence, it produced a situation that Caldwell's own legal team declined to contest. He resigned from the board before the second meeting convened. The investigation that followed was someone else's job. Eleanor had a company to run. The second board meeting was quieter than the first. Eleanor walked in without the launch blazer this time. She wore a dark blue jacket she'd bought last year and never had occasion to use, and her hair was thinner than it had been at the launch photo on the wall of the conference room, and she didn't draw attention to either of these facts or away from them. She set her materials down and looked at the 9 chairs and the 9 people in them, including Thomas Reed, who this time met her eyes. Before she spoke, one of the assistants slipped into the room and handed her a folded piece of paper. Eleanor opened it. It was a drawing. Crayon green and blue, the careful, deliberate lines of a child who had something specific in mind. The woman from all the previous drawings, the one who had started lying down, and then sitting, and then standing, was now walking forward, one hand out toward a set of doors. Beside her, smaller but drawn with equal care, was a figure with a wrench on his belt and a child holding his other hand. On the back, in Danny's careful, uneven letters, "Dad says you're the bravest person he's ever met." I believe him. He's usually right about people. D. Eleanor folded the paper and placed it in her jacket pocket. Then she ran the meeting. Ryan Caldwell was removed from the board and referred to federal investigators. The proposed acquisition by Hargrove Pharmaceutical was formally withdrawn. Nova Bridge's operating charter was reaffirmed. Eleanor Shaw remained CEO with a modified governance structure that distributed more operational responsibility to her leadership team, not because she was incapable, but because she was building something meant to outlast any single person's capacity to hold it alone, and she had decided somewhere in the past 2 months that this was not a weakness. When the meeting ended, Margaret Holloway stopped her in the hall. "The HIPAA filing was the right move," Holloway said. "I want you to know some of us were never going anywhere." "I know," Eleanor said. "I should have called sooner." "Yes," Holloway agreed. "You should have. 14 months is a long time. It is also in certain kinds of fights the minimum. Eleanor's treatment continued. The oncologist used the word responding at the 6-month mark, and then controlled at 12, and then carefully, without overselling it, stable. Not gone. Not cured. But manage the way you manage something you have decided you are stronger than not, by defeating it, but by refusing to be defined by it. She went back to the office on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Marcus had first knocked on her door, which she noticed and did not comment on. She took the elevator to the 38th floor first out of habit, and stood for a moment in the hallway outside the penthouse that no longer felt like a place she had almost ended in. Then she took the elevator back down to the 22nd floor, where Nova Bridge occupied 4,000 square feet of organized, controlled energy, and she walked to her desk and sat down and began to work. The foundation paperwork for the Nova Bridge Community Access Program took 3 months to finalize. Eleanor signed each page herself. The program's mandate was specific: connect the company's healthcare technology tools to families in income brackets that the existing system had consistently failed to reach. The directorship required someone who understood both the technology and the human geography of those gaps, not from a report, but from the inside. She called Marcus on a Thursday. "I'm not a businessman," he said when she explained the role. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's the point. He said he'd think about it." He called back in 2 hours. Danny's surgery was on a Tuesday in November, 14 months after a plumber from Brooklyn had knocked on a penthouse door and asked about a faucet. The procedure took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Marcus sat in the surgical waiting room with a paper cup of coffee that went cold in his hands, and he thought about parking lots and phone calls and the specific arithmetic of deciding to stay. Eleanor arrived an hour and she hadn't told him she was coming, and she didn't explain it when she sat down in the chair beside him. She had brought 2 sandwiches from a deli down the street, and they sat together in the waiting room and didn't say much, and the sandwiches went uneaten. And when the surgeon came out and said the words successful and stable and recovery, Eleanor watched Marcus put his face in his hands, and she put her hand on his back, the way you do for someone when there are no words that are the right size for the moment. The Nova Bridge Foundation covered Danny's surgery in full. Eleanor had signed that authorization herself 3 months earlier and filed it before anyone could suggest it was a conflict of interest, because it was not a conflict of interest. It was the entire point. 14 months after the morning with the toolbox and the marble floor, and 11 seconds that nobody could quite account for. Danny Webb stood in the lobby of New York Presbyterian with pink cheeks and a scar that was already fading, and an opinion about the elevator buttons that he shared with anyone who would listen. He found Eleanor near the entrance and grabbed her hand without preamble. "Eleanor." He said her name the way children say the names of adults they have decided to trust, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about liking people. "Do you want to come to dinner? Dad's making chicken noodle. He only knows how to make one thing, but I promise it's actually good." Eleanor looked past Danny to where Marcus was standing near the door, with his jacket on and his hands in his pockets, watching his son charm a $2.4 billion CEO in a hospital lobby, with the same expression he'd had on in that boardroom, steady, decided, not reconsidering. He lifted one shoulder. "I've got the star-shaped pasta. Can't guarantee the rest." Eleanor looked at this man who had sat in her hallway without being asked, who had crouched on her floor to pick up screws while she found her way back to the word yes, who had sent her burned cookies and crayon drawings and cups of tea, and never once asked her to be anything other than whatever she currently was. "Okay," she said. The Brooklyn apartment was small and warm and smelled like chicken broth and something slightly scorched, and the pasta was shaped like stars and had gone a little soft, and the 3 of them sat around a table that had a stack of Danny's drawings on one end and a Nova Bridge quarterly report on the other, and nobody moved either. Eleanor ate the soup. She sat in the yellow light of a kitchen in Brooklyn, in the home of a man who had walked into the darkest room of her life, and pretended very calmly that he was there about the pipes, and she thought, this is what staying looks like. Not the board meetings, not the press release her team would draft about Nova Bridge's new early detection feature, not the cover of Forbes. This, the soft, star-shaped pasta. The boy talking with his hands, the sound of someone who stayed. She had thought on that morning 14 months ago that she was done. She had been wrong about that. She was, it turned out, only beginning.